Welcome to the University of New Hampshire School of Law podcast, where every week our professors give legal insight on important news topics. Learn more about the law school by visiting law.unh.edu. Today we are with Ray Friel, visiting professor from the School of Law at the University of Limerick, to talk about the recent European Union fine of $5 billion for forcing cell phone makers to install Google's apps on their Android operating system. Please note, opinions discussed are solely the opinion of the faculty or host and do not constitute legal advice or necessarily represent the official views of the University of New Hampshire. So just start off with, what did the European Union take issue with?
Well, the issue really effectively is sort of a restraint on competition by tying Google's products with the sale of Android phones. And there are two ways you can look at that. One, of course, is that by doing that, they're creating a captive market. So if you want to sell an Android phone and you need things like Google Maps, you're going to have to take a lot of Google products. The other way of looking at it, of course, is it's actually a good counterbalance to the potential dominance of the iOS system that Apple operate. But the European Union has taken the view that Google have gone over and beyond the necessary minimum for a business model and are now beginning to abuse their position.
So basically they're either making cell phone manufacturers have redundant applications or being stuck with just what Google offers to prevent that redundancy.
That's right. That would be the view of the European Union, in particular the Commission. And I think it's probably important to see where the European Commission is coming from on this. In some ways, all antitrust or competition policy is driven by policy goals rather than actually the issues involved. So it's about what does the European Union wish to achieve. And in antitrust or competition law in the European Union, it is about ensuring a single market. And so what they're most concerned about is you don't have partition of the marketplace by private industry, given that partition of the marketplace by states has been removed. And so that's the backdrop. There's also probably a hidden motivation behind it, which is that if you'll notice, a lot of activity by the European Commission is against major American tech firms. Google, Facebook, Amazon, all of these are coming under pressure. And it's reflective of the fact that, first of all, the European Union has no counterweight to that. There is no European Google. There is no European Amazon. And that's one of the issues that they're trying to deal with effectively. And Europe has now become, to some extent, because it is actually a larger market than the US, it increasingly sees itself as a commercial police person, whereas to some extent the Americans may have seen themselves as a military policeman of the world. Europeans are almost like a commercial policeman. And you'll see this in terms of not simply the Google fine, which I think is interesting, but across the spectrum, including things like data privacy rights, which are increasingly important. The Europeans have taken a very narrow view of what you can do with data, and that's impacting heavily on US firms as well.
Now, how did they come up with this $5 billion figure? Is it just beat for the shock value, or?
To an extent, it is a bit like, US legal awards. We always look on our side of the Atlantic. I think I saw somebody get $298 million because they might have got cancer from a particular weed killer display. They're headline figures. And so there is an element of shock in it. There is a mathematical formula. So it's a percentage of worldwide turnover. And in a company like Google, $5 billion, it's not a lot of money. I think they have something like $100 billion in cash reserves. They make $9-10 billion a quarter. So it's not a huge amount of money. So there's no point in giving a €2 million fine because Google are just going, I'll write you 4 million and that'll cover the next infringement. There's also the way that most antitrust works is the people who investigate the wrongdoing are also the people who find whether you've breached it, and they will set the fine. They're fully aware that there's an appeals process after this. And they know that the $5 billion actually will not be paid, that it will be reduced, even if they succeed. What's interesting to note, I think, more than anything else, is that by making the fine that way, what they have said to Google is, you have 90 days to bring yourself within compliance. That's the more onerous aspect.
That's a lot.
Yes. Because that involves a significant change to Google's business model.
Yeah. I mean, what exactly are they expecting them to do over this time frame?
Well, strictly speaking, they're supposed to remove the infringement so that even if, for example, Google are found to be in the clear subsequently through the appeals process, they cannot continue what is currently an infringement. And so the idea effectively is they pay the $5 billion, but they also take the steps within the 90 days to remove at least the most egregious complaints. That will actually have a knock-on impact in our European phones, because a lot of the cost of our phones is artificially reduced because Google pay for this and they supply the materials. So we could see changes along there. But the European Union uses this as a fact that it's what can you say? It's a negotiating tactic. Mm-hmm. We put this on you. The $5 billion, you can write that out of pocket change, but it gets public headlines. Everybody thinks, wow, the European Union has really stood up to these people. Few people can actually get behind it and say, oh, $5 billion is nothing to these. But for Google, their big worry, I think, is about how they change. And that's something where it will bring them to the table to negotiate with the European Commission.
I mean, as a technology person,
sure.
Millennial, we can't even get consistent Android updates on a regular basis. So one of the big reasons why iOS has been able to stand out and do so much is pretty much everything can get the latest version for free.
Yes. Well, that is its own.
I mean, how on earth are they going to implement something like this?
And again, I think one needs to see a lot of competition law and antitrust in a greater context. In addition to the fact that there are very few, if any, European firms that will rival the likes of Google, there's also the fact that Google and Facebook and all of these major companies have managed to use the European tax system coupled with the American tax system to avoid paying any tax. And so we see this in lots of different ways, that this is another situation where the European Commission is saying effectively, look, you can't go on making billions and billions of dollars off of our citizens without paying some fair share of tax. And my own country, Ireland, has been responsible for this by clever use of corporate structures and combining it with others. So I think this is not to be seen in isolation. I think the sanction is quite onerous. You have 90 days to remove that. But I think what we're seeing here is a broad movement across all of the tech sector from the US and its operations in Europe, and trying to get them to face up to the fact that they're going to have to start paying more taxes. And I think what would be good would be if the US were also to take a similar approach and to say, look, you need to start paying taxes as well. And that would remove then what I think are things which are harmful in terms of tech development. I'm not, as you can tell, a millennial by any stretch of the imagination, or certainly a different millennial. So in those circumstances, I think what you're looking for is something where we can carry on with the technology, because technology is changing rapidly our understanding of antitrust law. The old measures don't translate. How many shops you have in the high street is not the issue. This information in Google, it's not limited. There's not a limited number of washing machines, or there's not a limited number of cameras. So our antitrust laws in general, and in Europe in particular, are having difficulty facing up to that reality. And it's more like what we would call essential facilities. Google is an essential facilities. Everybody uses it. The likes of Yahoo have long gone, and Bing isn't, really competitive. But those sort of search engines, they're not diminished by the more people that use them. And it's trying to find a regulatory model that will work. And I think what you're seeing here is twofold from the European Commission. One is an attempt to sort of control American firms who are being too dominant in this. And the second is to try and work out how exactly we can create a new regulatory framework to ensure that bad things don't happen. And Google is not free from blame here, in fairness. They are clearly
very aggressive with their...
Yes.
I mean, like I said before, I mean, if you get an inexpensive Android phone, it is just loaded with bloatware from the manufacturer, and then you get all the redundant Google apps that essentially do the same thing for better or worse, whether they're better or worse applications. I mean, there's so many things they dump on these Android devices.
Absolutely. And I think that is the thing for both sides of the Atlantic to try and work through, because, and again, I'm not too bad in the technology, but a lot of sort of the traditional lawyers would be very reluctant to understand this. So when you're talking about bloatware, they're all going, what?
Yeah.
So I think that is an issue. Absolutely. Yeah.
Do they expect this to encourage people to compete with Google, or is this strictly of beating down these enormous companies that they view as having too much power?
It's both. And if from a European context, there is a significant amount of funding going forward, trying to encourage the development of new technologies and new uses of those technologies. And the unfortunate thing, to be honest with you, is that the country which has probably been the most successful at this is the United Kingdom, which will be leaving the European Union. And France is trying to take that space, but they're finding it difficult because of their cultural resistance to things like innovation and change. They're very proud of their traditional history. The UK was at the forefront of this, but there is a big European fund which is trying to encourage new technologies to develop at a European level. This frontline stuff that we're seeing today is essentially the European Commission reminding foreign companies, and particularly US companies, that they are going to be subject of heavy controls whilst that is happening. So there is an element of anti-competition going on by the Commission itself as it creates a bubble-free space where they're hoping that some European tech companies will emerge. But the evidence isn't good to date.
Do we expect Google to be able to ease up these restrictions they're trying to put on, or is it basically this is what Google is required to happen in the European Union?
I think what you will see effectively is that there will be negotiations, so there will be some easing up, but will Google have to give everything up? The answer, I think, is no. This will drag on for many years yet to come, and often the resolution of these disputes comes when the issue has passed, because technology is so fast moving, in a sense. So it's really about, it's like the police officer sitting in the car as you pass by. He wants you to slow down. Do you know what I mean? So puts on the flashing lights just to give you a little bit of a scare, and you drive on down. You drive slower and safer from then on.
Before we wrap up here, you're actually visiting from the School of Law at the University of Limerick. What do you specialize in, and what are you teaching at UNH Law this fall?
Sure. I actually specialize in commercial law, international commercial law. So I do international business transactions, and I do competition law. I've been here for a number of years before. I've taught mini courses during the fall, but this fall I'm be teaching a one credit course on EU competition law as it transpires. Quite topical. And we're going to have fun with it, because what we're going to do is it's a sort of asynchronous course. Some of the materials will be downloadable. Some of it will be done through video conferencing while I'm still in Limerick. And we'll be having 2 days here at Concord, because I just love any excuse to come back to Concord and the law school. And we'll have sort of a nice sort of session, and we'll be able to discuss and relate things, and there'll be free pizza for people. So
there's that motivation.
That's the motivator. As long as the Commission doesn't catch me.
Yes. Thanks, Professor Ray Friel, for joining me today, and thank you for listening to the show. Get the back episodes at law.unh.edu/podcast, which also has links to subscribe to the show on all your favorite podcast services, including Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and now Spotify. Be sure to like and comment. It really helps spread word about the show. Talk to you next Thursday. Opinions discussed are solely the opinion of the faculty or host and do not constitute legal advice or necessarily represent the official views of the University of New Hampshire.